Peter Parker is still early in his career as Spider-Man. He has superhuman strength, speed, agility, a spider sense that warns him when danger is coming, and homemade web shooters that let him move through Queens faster than almost anyone alive. But he is still inexperienced, still learning what his powers can and cannot solve, and he has never encountered anything like cursed energy. Satoru Gojo looked at the teenager hanging from the ceiling and decided he was interesting. Peter didn't need more power. He needed someone who could show him what his abilities were actually capable of. So what happens when the strongest sorcerer alive starts training Spider-Man from the beginning? Before Tony Stark, before the Avengers, before any of it. This is not what you're expecting. The timeline begins before Peter Parker has become involved with the Avengers. He's still operating around Queens in his homemade suit, using web shooters he designed himself, fighting ordinary criminals and the occasional enhanced individual. He's already unusually capable, strong enough to lift cars, fast enough that most opponents can't land clean strikes, and smart enough to have built technology that puts him years ahead of anyone his age. What he doesn't have is any exposure to the supernatural. That changes when a dimensional anomaly briefly connects his universe to the world of Jujutsu Kaisen. The crossover introduced a cursed spirit into Peter's world. In Jujutsu terms, cursed spirits are beings produced from accumulated negative human emotion, invisible to ordinary people, and normally impossible to exercise through ordinary physical force alone. The dimensional overlap also brings Peter into contact with the same cursed energy system Gojo's world operates on. Peter doesn't gain an innate technique from this. He simply proves capable of producing and learning to control cursed energy once Gojo shows him how. A person who cannot perceive cursed energy can still be attacked without understanding what is happening to them. Peter's situation is unusual because his spider sense still responds to the danger. It doesn't give him the ability to see the spirit. It gives him the warning, that immediate, wordless certainty that something is about to hit him. He reacts before he understands what he's reacting to, jumping clear of a debris strike that he never saw coming. When the strike happens again, he fires a web into empty air and feels it attached to something solid. The outline of the curse becomes something he can track, even if he still can't see it. Now, the problem is that his attacks aren't exercising yet. His strength connects, but ordinary punches aren't enough to properly damage the curse. And Peter has no cursed energy or cursed tool to bridge the gap. He's fighting something he can't meaningfully put down, with a threat sense that tells him where to dodge but not how to win. He defaults to the only reliable option he has. Keep moving, keep the spirit occupied, and don't let it land anything clean. That's when Gojo arrives through the same dimensional anomaly. He understands the threat immediately. His sixth size, an ability that gives him extraordinary perception of cursed energy, lets him analyze the spirit and the situation within seconds. He also notices Peter almost immediately. The teenager has no jujutsu training, no cursed technique, no formal background in anything Gojo recognizes. He's surviving entirely through physical ability and an instinctive danger sense that Gojo finds genuinely unusual. Gojo uses curse technique reversal red to destroy the curse. He generates positive energy through reverse curse technique and feeds it into Limitless, producing the reversed application of the technique, a violent repulsive force powerful enough to exercise a spirit in one strike. The threat is gone. Peter drops to the warehouse floor, and Gojo takes a long look at the teenager, who just survived a cursed spirit encounter with zero preparation and no understanding of what he was fighting. Peter isn't a sorcerer. He hasn't been training in cursed energy, and there's no evidence he was born with an innate technique. His abilities come from the radioactive spider bite that transformed him. His spider sense is part of that transformation, not a jujutsu ability wearing a different name. But Gojo doesn't see a dead end. He sees a teenager who already has extraordinary physical capabilities and an instinctive awareness that might be worth something if it was properly developed. He decides to find out how far that goes. Peter's first encounter with a cursed spirit becomes the beginning of something much larger. But the question now isn't just whether Gojo's interest is justified, it's what he intends to do with it, and how much of Peter's existing identity will survive what comes next. Gojo's first decision is straightforward. He gives Peter 4 months. This isn't really a formal agreement, it's more just Gojo telling him what to do. He tells Peter that if the concept of a spider-powered teenager learning jujutsu is going to mean anything at all, Peter needs to demonstrate over the next 4 months that it's worth taking further. Gojo will come back to Queens several times a week and teach Peter the fundamentals. If Peter proves he can handle it, the training will continue after the initial trial, and eventually, Gojo will introduce him to the actual jujutsu world in Japan. If it doesn't justify the training, Gojo will have had an interesting experience, and Peter will go back to fighting criminals without cursed energy. Peter agrees immediately, and spends the first 3 sessions unable to do anything Gojo asks. Cursed energy doesn't respond to physical strength. It doesn't respond to intelligence either, at least not in the way Peter is used to applying it. Peter tries to analyze it like an engineering problem, and finds that there's nothing mechanical to grab onto. The energy follows its own rules, and those rules aren't written down anywhere. Gojo has to correct the same mistake multiple times before Peter's attempts start producing consistent results. The frustration is genuine. Peter has never been bad at learning something quickly, and being comprehensively bad at this for weeks is a specific kind of difficult for someone used to picking things up fast. His first real breakthrough is cursed energy reinforcement, coating the body with cursed energy to enhance physical abilities and make attacks more effective against supernatural opponents. The change in his combat performance is immediate. His punches hit harder. His durability improves when he reinforces himself before an impact. His movements become more effective because he can combine his natural agility with cursed energy instead of relying entirely on his physical foundation. Gojo watches us for a moment and then says casually, "You know, most people's first reinforcement attempts break their own fingers. Yours is already cleaner than Nanami's was at this stage. Don't let it get to your head." He then assigns Peter 3 more weeks of basic repetition exercise, because that's what Gojo considers an appropriate response to genuine progress. The consistency challenge is harder than learning the technique. Peter has spent years moving on instinct. Spider sense warns him, him. His body reacts before his mind catches up. Curse energy requires a different kind of discipline. He has to maintain deliberate control while simultaneously moving, attacking, protecting himself, and managing his web shooters. The number of things he needs to manage at once is genuinely overwhelming in the early stages. Gojo's solution is controlled curse spirit encounters. Peter begins fighting curses under conditions Gojo has arranged. Early encounters are less about winning and more about keeping curse energy active while he moves. He discovers that his webs still function usefully. They restrain physical targets and reveal the outlines of invisible spirits, while curse energy allows him to reinforce the attacks that follow. The combination starts to produce something recognizable as a fighting style, even if it's still rough. Then he fails. 6 weeks into the trial, during one of these controlled encounters, Peter moves to finish a curse before he can reach an alleyway behind a restaurant. He's confident. He's been reinforcing consistently for weeks. He fires a web, closes a distance, and goes to exercise it, and his cursed energy control fails under pressure. The energy dissipates at the wrong moment. The spirit gets past him. A delivery worker who had stepped out of a side door catches one strike before Gojo can intervene. The man survives. The injury isn't permanent, but he gets hurt, and Peter is the reason. Gojo exercises the curse and doesn't say anything critical. That's almost worse. Peter is quiet for a long time, and what he comes back to training with after that is something that goes beyond wanting to learn quickly. He's been fighting criminals for years, and always operated on the assumption that his speed and strength would prevent collateral damage. This is the first time he's been directly wrong about that. It costs him something. Not his confidence entirely, but the comfortable assumption that learning new abilities is just a technical problem with a technical solution. He goes back to the fundamentals harder than he ever had before. Gojo notices the difference. He doesn't comment on it directly, which is its own kind of instruction. Peter also starts improving his cursed energy control under pressure rather than just in controlled exercises. He learns to reinforce specific parts of his body at the right moment, legs before explosive movement, arms immediately before striking, instead of wasting energy across his entire body. He begins experimenting with using cursed energy around his web-based attacks, reinforcing his arms before a hard web yank, his legs before changing direction, and his grip when a restraint is under pressure. The synthetic web fluid itself isn't magically converted into cursed energy. Peter is learning to use reinforcement to make the movements and physical follow-ups around his equipment more effective. His spider sense and cursed energy control start functioning as a single system rather than two separate tools. By the 4th month, he's not just surviving encounters with curses, he's finishing them. The foundation is solid. The question Gojo said at the beginning of the year is getting closer to its answer, but the foundation is only the first part. Before Japan, whatever Gojo is building towards, Peter still needs to understand what his specific advantages are and what they can't do. Gojo's 6 eyes makes him extraordinarily capable of seeing and processing cursed energy. The precision they provide is part of what makes Limitless as powerful as it is. Peter doesn't have anything like that. His spider sense works differently. It's a danger warning, not a perception ability. It tells him something is wrong or about to hurt him. It doesn't tell him what something is, how it works, or what its technique is. Gojo's insight is that teaching Peter to develop cursed energy sensing could give him a second source of information that, used alongside spider sense, becomes considerably more useful than either ability alone. The early practice is slow. Cursed energy perception requires a kind of accumulated experience that most trained sorcerers build over years, and Peter is starting from nothing. He can barely distinguish variation in cursed energy at close range, let alone read what a specific technique does or where a hidden spirit is positioned. But spider sense keeps running underneath all of it. When a cursed spirit approaches during training, Peter feels a danger before he consciously identifies what he's sensing. With enough repetition, he starts connecting that instinctive warning to the actual presence of cursed energy. The two abilities don't merge into a new version of the 6 eyes. Peter doesn't suddenly gain Gojo's precision, and he can't reproduce the analytical depth that makes those eyes exceptional. What changes is that Peter becomes better at interpreting information his own body's already giving him. This changes his combat style in practical terms. Before, Peter often reacted after spider sense warned him. With training, he starts using the warning to predict when an attack is likely to originate and moves before the threat fully develops. Cursed energy sensing adds another layer. He can now detect the presence of spirits he previously couldn't locate at all, and he can recognize when a sorcerer nearby is using cursed energy, even if reading the technique itself remains beyond him. His movement system starts to become something genuinely unusual in the jujutsu context. Most sorcerers develop their combat style around 2-dimensional ground movement, with occasional vertical elements. Peter has been moving in 3 dimensions since he was 15. He uses web lines to reposition in midair, as well as changing direction during swings in ways most opponents can't anticipate. He also approaches targets from angles that someone standing on the ground is unlikely to account for. Cursed energy reinforcement makes these movements faster and more stable. His spider sense helps him decide when to change direction before an attack arrives. Gojo correctly notes that Peter's greatest advantage isn't raw power, it's information. He receives constant warnings about threats around him, and his physical abilities let him respond to those warnings extremely quickly. Cursed energy training doesn't transform into an omniscient system. It makes Peter better at using the information he was already getting. But Gojo also makes sure Peter understands the limits. Spider sense tells him that danger is coming. It doesn't explain what an opponent's technique does, or how to counter it, or whether greater speed will solve the problem. Powerful sorcerers can create conditions that spider sense doesn't automatically clarify. A warning that danger is approaching, and an understanding of what to do about it are two different things, and Peter needs both. So Peter learns to combine instinct with observation. He watches opponents before engaging. He studies how they use cursed energy. He pays attention to movement patterns. Then he lets spider sense fill in the information information he can't consciously process in time. It becomes the core of his fighting style, and it's going to matter, because what Gojo is building toward requires Peter to be functional in environments where standing still and studying an opponent first isn't an option. Now, here's the question. Can Peter develop a curse technique on his own? In Jujutsu, an innate technique isn't something a sorcerer invents through practice. Innate techniques are engraved in the brain at birth, and most sorcerers spend their entire careers refining the specific technique they were born with rather than developing new ones. Learning to control cursed energy doesn't automatically produce a technique. The two things are related but separate. Peter's abilities came from the radioactive spider bite. There is no reason to assume that the bite secretly gave him a jujutsu technique, and Gojo doesn't treat it that way. Instead, he tests whether Peter already possesses an innate technique that is simply never manifested. The answer is no. Peter can manipulate cursed energy, reinforce his body, and apply what he's learned to his existing fighting style, but nothing presents itself as an innate technique, and Gojo doesn't push him towards one. That limitation actually clarifies Gojo's approach rather than complicating it. Peter doesn't need a cursed technique. His physical abilities already give him an unusual foundation. His spider sense gives him an advantage that most sorcerers don't possess. Gojo redirects the training towards something more productive, getting Peter to apply cursed energy with enough precision that the absence of a technique stops being relevant. Peter's web shooters become especially important here. They're an extension of his intelligence and engineering ability. Instead of inventing a fictional cursed energy web ability, Peter learns to incorporate cursed energy into the way he already uses his equipment. He reinforces his body before launching from a web line, giving the movement more force and stability. He uses cursed energy to strengthen his grip when an opponent tries to break through a web restraint. Peter reinforces his physical strikes after using his webs to control positioning. The result is a fighting style that looks familiar from the outside, but has become considerably more sophisticated in practice. Peter can move through a battlefield using his webs while maintaining cursed energy reinforcement. He can fight cursed spirits using tools he designed himself. He can switch between range control and close range combat without abandoning either system. Gojo eventually pushes Peter towards something harder than reinforcement: precise concentration of cursed energy into individual strikes, applied with enough control that the force doesn't scatter. The improvement is less dramatic than learning a new ability, but more significant in practice. A skilled sorcerer doesn't simply produce as much cursed energy as possible. They control exactly how and where it's applied. Peter's intelligence makes him particularly good at this. He treats combat like a problem that can be analyzed. He notes what works, identifies mistakes, and changes his approach after every session. Gojo provides the experience that Peter lacks. Peter's ability to absorb and apply those lessons quickly does the rest. By the end of the 4-month trial that Gojo originally proposed, Peter has developed something he couldn't have described at the start: a personal cursed energy fighting style that doesn't belong to any existing school of jujutsu, because it was built around abilities that no sorcerer in the jujutsu world possesses. Gojo watches a training session near the end of the 4 months and makes a decision. Peter is worth continuing to train. Japan can come later. For now, Peter still has a life in Queens, and Gojo has no intention of rushing him into jujutsu society before he's ready. The most significant change Gojo makes to Peter is psychological. Peter's biggest problem has never been a lack of power. Even before meeting Gojo, he was already considerably stronger and faster than ordinary humans. His problem has always been learning how to use that power while managing everything that comes with being Spider-Man. The losses, the guilt, the constant weight of knowing that being fast enough and strong enough still hasn't been enough sometimes. Gojo understands that problem better than he lets on. He spent years carrying the expectations that come with being the strongest sorcerer alive. He knows what it means to possess overwhelming power while still being responsible for protecting specific people who get hurt anyway. His response to that weight is very different from Peter's. Gojo's confidence reads as casual to the point of arrogance, but the source of it isn't arrogance. It's the product of having genuinely worked through what it means to be as powerful as he is and decided to own it rather than apologize for it. His teaching reflects that. Gojo doesn't push Peter towards cruelty or indifference. What he pushes against is hesitation. Peter has a habit of holding back because he knows how easily his strength could seriously injure someone. That caution is part of what makes him a hero, but it can also make him slow in situations where being slow means someone else gets hurt, which Peter already knows from the encounter 6 weeks into their training. Gojo forces him to be more decisive. He teaches Peter that protecting people doesn't require apologizing for having the power to do it. Peter's personality doesn't change. He remains talkative, prone to making jokes when he's nervous, and genuinely troubled by the parts of this work that have costs. He still overthinks. He still cares about every person in every situation more than is probably strategically useful. Gojo's influence doesn't alter any of that. It simply gives those qualities a more stable foundation, something Peter can actually stand on instead of sinking into. Gojo also teaches Peter that strength carries responsibility. That lesson matters because Gojo's philosophy as a teacher isn't simply about creating powerful fighters. It's about helping younger sorcerers build enough strength and independence to make their own choices about the world they're inheriting. Peter fits naturally into that. He already wants to protect people. He doesn't need to be convinced that responsibility matters. What he needed was a teacher who didn't treat his existing capabilities as a problem to be managed, but as a foundation to be built from. The technology question also gets addressed here. Tony Stark's engineering isn't something Peter rejects as a concept. Peter is an inventor, and his web shooters are already evidence of what he can produce under constraint. Gojo's influence teaches him something more specific. His equipment should support his abilities rather than substitute for weakness in his fundamentals. Peter keeps developing his technology. At the same time, he becomes capable of fighting without depending on it. If his web shooters are damaged, his physical abilities and cursed energy control remain. If his technology fails, Spider Sense sense and his combat training still function. He becomes more independent, without losing the part of himself that makes him want to build things in the first place. By the time Tony Stark finally finds him, the difference in Peter is obvious. Not louder or more aggressive, just more settled, more comfortable with the person he is, rather than the one he thought he was supposed to become. Gojo's 4-month trial has ended, but the training hasn't. Peter continues practicing with them whenever the dimensional connection allows it, building on the fundamentals while still living his life in Queens. That matters, because the next person who tries to shape Spider-Man isn't a sorcerer, it's Tony Stark. By the time the Avengers begin dividing over the Sokovia Accords, Peter has already spent several months developing his abilities under Gojo. That is not enough time to turn him into a veteran sorcerer, but it is enough to make him noticeably more disciplined than the teenager Tony Stark expected to find. Tony can still discover Spider-Man and recognize his potential. What he finds is a kid who has already had a powerful mentor drilling judgment, control, and independence into him. Tony offers Peter access to advanced technology and recruits him for the confrontation in Germany. Peter accepts the trip, partly because Tony is offering him a chance to help, and partly because refusing would mean staying home while a fight between Avengers is about to happen. But Gojo's training has made one thing clear: having power doesn't mean surrendering your judgment to someone else. Peter agrees to work with Tony, not to switch his brain off for him. Tony still gives him the upgraded Spider-Man suit and transports him to Germany, preserving the relationship that can later lead to the Iron Spider armor. Once the airport fight begins, Peter's priority quickly becomes preventing serious injuries rather than blindly helping one side defeat the other. His presence immediately changes the dynamic. Peter begins on Tony's side, because that is the situation he agreed to enter, but he doesn't treat Steve's team like villains. His priority is stopping the fight before someone is seriously injured or killed. He uses his mobility to separate combatants and restrain people rather than trying to hurt them. Bucky becomes one of his first targets, because Tony's team is trying to prevent Steve and Bucky from leaving, and Peter has been told that Bucky is a dangerous enhanced fugitive. Peter does not yet know the full story about Zemo or the other Winter Soldiers. Peter's spider sense lets him react to Bucky's attacks before they connect, while his cursed energy reinforcement gives him enough physical strength to control the Winter Soldier without destroying his arm. Sam presents a different problem. His aerial mobility means Peter has to use his webs to interfere with the wings and bring the fight back towards the ground where it's more contained. Then Scott grows. Ant-Man's giant man form is the most immediate threat to the airport structure and everyone in it. Trying to overpower him directly would cause exactly the kind of damage Peter came to prevent. Peter does something Gojo would recognize immediately. He stops trying to solve the problem through force and starts using the environment. He attaches web lines to stable structures and uses his mobility to redirect Giant Man's movements away from the other combatants. His objective isn't to knock Scott unconscious, it's to make sure the airport doesn't become a disaster. The Peter Parker who first started operating in Queens might have thrown himself directly at the biggest threat and hoped his strength was enough. This version analyzes the battlefield first. Peter eventually reaches Steve and Bucky. He understands, without agreeing with every decision Steve has made, that Steve is trying to protect someone he believes is being wrongly treated. That understanding keeps Peter from escalating the fight further. His involvement doesn't end with one side defeating the other. It shortens the battle and limits the damage. Steve and Bucky still escape. The Sokovia Accords aren't resolved. Peter doesn't have the authority to fix any of that. But when it's over and Peter is walking away from the airport, there's one quiet moment that stays with him. The realization that every person on both sides of the fight was trying, in their own way, to do the right thing. It's not really a comforting thought, it's a lot more complicated. Tony watches Peter leave and realizes, for the first time, that someone else already taught this kid how to be dangerous. He doesn't know who, and he intends to find out. Peter's next major challenge is closer to home. Adrian Toomes has built a criminal operation around salvaged alien technology left behind from the Battle of New York. The Vulture suit gives him aerial mobility, heavy weaponry, and the ability to attack from angles that most opponents can't account for. In the original timeline, Peter's lack of experience makes Toomes a serious threat. This version of Peter approaches the situation differently. His months of training have taught him to investigate before engaging. He studies Toomes' operation first, identifies the locations where equipment is being moved, observes the Vulture suit's capabilities, and looks for the exact limitations before the first confrontation. Toomes can attack from altitude, change direction quickly, as well as firing weapons from a distance, but what he can't do is make Peter's spider sense disappear. Every time Toomes dives or fires, Peter receives a warning. The first confrontation is considerably shorter as a result. Toomes attacks from above at high speed. Peter moves before it connects and attaches several webs to the suit. Rather than trying to overpower the entire machine, he uses the webbing to restrict the Vulture's movement and his cursed energy reinforcement to hold position while Toomes tries to break free. Peter redirects him away from the populated areas, using the surrounding structures and his own momentum. Toomes escapes, but Peter now understands what the suit can and can't do. The second encounter happens at one of Toomes' facilities. Peter targets the suit's mobility rather than trying to destroy the whole machine. He webs into the wings, cursed energy reinforcement to tear away sections of equipment when Toomes gets close enough. Toomes eventually loses control of the suit and crashes. Peter catches him. In that moment, catching the man who just spent 2 fights trying to kill him demonstrates what Gojo's training actually changed. Peter is considerably stronger now. He also hasn't become careless with that strength. He turns Toomes over to the authorities, secures the Chitauri technology, and the damage from the whole encounter is a fraction of what it was in the original timeline. The Vulture was still a human criminal using technology, but what comes next is going to be something else entirely. Thanos is a different category of problem. By the time the Avengers learn that Thanos is actively pursuing the remaining Infinity Stones, Peter is far more experienced than the teenager Tony originally tried to recruit. He spent years developing his physical abilities, cursed energy control, and combat instincts. He still isn't close to Gojo's level, but he has become an unusually capable hybrid fighter. The question the whole training arc has been building towards, how far can Spider-Man go, is about to get a real answer, against an opponent that is extremely powerful. Now, Peter's relationship with Tony continues after the airport, even if this version of Peter is more independent than the one Tony originally mentored. That relationship still gives Tony a reason to build the Iron Spider suit as an emergency upgrade. So when Peter follows Ebony Maw's ship out of Earth's atmosphere, Tony can deploy the suit to keep him alive during the ascent. Peter then joins Tony, Doctor Strange, Peter Quill, Drax, and Mantis on Titan. The objective is to stop Thanos, and remove the gauntlet before he can complete it. Thanos possesses 4 Infinity Stones: power, space, reality, and soul. He is physically overwhelming even without them. The stones give him access to abilities Peter has never encountered. Peter's spider sense reacts the moment Thanos attacks. The warnings come early and continuously. That gives Peter opportunities a normal human wouldn't have, but it doesn't make him immune to Thanos' strength or the effects of the stones. He knows the attacks are coming. He still has to move fast enough to matter. Peter reinforces himself more aggressively than he has in any previous fight. His strength and durability increase. He moves around Thanos, using the debris scattered across Titan, combining web lines with cursed energy enhancement jumps to prevent himself from becoming a stationary target. For a period, he can contribute meaningfully, evading direct strikes, using webs to interfere with Thanos' movement, landing reinforced hits when the opportunity opens. The difference in power remains enormous. The Power Stone produces devastating attacks. The Space Stone lets Thanos manipulate distance and reposition himself. The Reality Stone creates an entirely different problem because it alters the environment around Peter, changing matter and reshaping the battlefield in ways that make conventional movement and web-based strategies unreliable. Spider-Sense warns him that danger is coming. It doesn't explain how a stone is changing the physics of the space he's moving through, but Peter eventually gets an opening. He concentrates cursed energy into a physical strike with the precision he's been building towards for years, and for once, the timing aligns almost impossibly well. His cursed energy lands within 1/millionth of a second of the physical impact. Space distorts around the hit, and the force spikes far beyond an ordinary reinforced punch. Peter feels the difference immediately. It isn't an innate technique, and it isn't something he can simply activate on command. Everything Gojo taught him about timing and control has finally created the conditions for a Black Flash. It doesn't end the fight though. It doesn't place Peter anywhere near Thanos' level, but it proves something real, that Peter can hurt an opponent whose durability is completely beyond anything he's previously faced. Years of training produced something in that single moment that no amount of borrowed technology could have replicated. Thanos adapts immediately, using the stones to control distance and pull Peter onto the defensive. Spider-Sense keeps him alive. The stones keep the fight from being winnable. Peter continues alongside the others, creating openings, keeping the pressure distributed, giving the team another fast-moving presence. But the plan fails. Thanos obtains the Time Stone from Doctor Strange and leaves Titan. Against more opponents, his combination of physical ability, Spider-Sense, and cursed energy gives him enormous advantages. Against Thanos, those advantages weren't enough. He's become powerful, but he hasn't become invincible. That distinction sits with him differently than it might have before the Black Flash, because now he knows exactly what he can do, which makes knowing what he can't do more precise. Peter survives the battle, but not what comes next. Thanos reaches Wakanda, completes the Infinity Gauntlet, and snaps his fingers. Peter is among the half of all life erased. 5 years later, the Avengers reverse the snap, and Peter returns, experiencing those lost years as only moments. After the final battle with Thanos, Peter resumes his life, and eventually, so does his training with Gojo. Gojo eventually takes Peter to Japan and introduces him to Jujutsu High. The higher-ups push back immediately, an outsider with no innate technique, trained privately by Gojo without formal institutional review, representing an unknown variable in a system built on classification and controlled information. Gojo gets Peter in by bargaining for it. The specifics of what he offers are typically unstated, because Gojo finds it entertaining to make the higher-ups nervous, but Peter arrives knowing his presence is contested. For Peter, this is the first time he's experienced the Jujutsu world as something other than an unexplained threat appearing in a city. He meets students who have grown up understanding cursed energy and have spent their lives learning to fight curses. The differences in their approaches to work are immediate. Yuji Itadori is an exceptionally capable physical fighter who became involved with Jujutsu after becoming the vessel of Ryomen Sukuna. His instincts for combat and his natural relationship with cursed energy is something Peter finds genuinely impressive. Megumi Fushiguro's 10 Shadows technique, the ability to summon Shikigami from shadows, is a kind of innate technique Peter was told he doesn't have, and watching it work gives him a concrete sense of what the absence means in comparison. Nobara Kugisaki's straw doll technique attacks targets through physical connections involving her nails in a straw doll, operating on principles that require the soul-based understanding Peter is still building. Peter's approach is less specialized than any of theirs. He doesn't have an innate technique. He has physical abilities, Spider-Sense, web shooters, and cursed energy reinforcement working together. In collaborative missions, the versatility of that combination turns out to be genuinely useful. He can move through urban environments quickly, restrain curses with webbing, and use cursed energy to finish what his physical attacks start. His Spider-Sense adds a warning system that can identify threats outside his normal visual range. Then he encounters Mahito. Peter's Spider-Sense reacts to Mahito more intensely than almost anything Peter has encountered since Thanos. The warning is continuous and urgent, but it doesn't explain what idle transfiguration does. Peter understands that physical contact is dangerous, so he keeps his distance, and uses webs to restrict Mahito's movement. He also attacks from positions that make direct contact difficult. His cursed energy reinforcement increases the damage his physical strikes can do. do. Mahito's durability is deceptive. He isn't simply healing ordinary injuries. Ido Transfiguration lets him maintain and reshape the form of his own soul, and his body follows that shape. Peter's cursed energy reinforced strikes can still hit Mahito, knock him back, interrupt his movement, or physically displace him, but they do not accumulate meaningful lasting damage unless Peter can affect the soul itself. Overpowering Mahito through raw physical force therefore isn't a reliable way to win. The fight becomes a battle of information. Peter's spider sense gives him an advantage when Mahito approaches, but Mahito is intelligent enough to recognize patterns in Peter's movement. He starts using transfigured humans and altered body configurations to create positions where Peter has fewer safe routes. Peter has to keep moving, pulling himself across the environment with webs, changing direction constantly, using everything Gojo taught him about staying calm when a situation becomes unpredictable. And then Peter runs directly into the limit. He doesn't possess Yuji's unusual awareness of the soul that comes from sharing a body with Sukuna. Peter has learned that souls exist and understands the theory behind techniques that affect them, but knowledge is not the same as direct perception. His reinforced attacks can physically move and disrupt Mahito's body, but they cannot reliably damage the shape of Mahito's soul the way Yuji's attacks can. Peter survives by refusing to let Mahito land what he needs. It's not really a victory, but it's not really a defeat either. It's recognition, in the middle of a fight, that Peter cannot win the way he expected to, that he has found the actual boundary of his abilities. Peter eventually realizes that surviving the fight and winning it are two different problems. Spider Sense gives him just enough warning to avoid Mahito's hands, so Peter uses his webs and three-dimensional movement to create distance and escape rather than gamble on a battle he has no reliable way to finish. Mahito tries to close the gap, but Peter is built for movement through a city and refuses to give him contact he needs. Peter finally reaches a safe distance as Gojo closes in on the disturbance, forcing Mahito to abandon the pursuit rather than remain for a confrontation with him. Peter is breathing hard in an alleyway somewhere he doesn't immediately recognize, and the feeling he has isn't quite defeat. It's something more unsettling, the specific knowledge of what he can't do. After years of building a fighting style that covers almost every situation, he has found one that it doesn't cover. Gojo uses it as another lesson. Some techniques require specific counters, specialized knowledge, or cooperation between sorcerers. Becoming stronger doesn't remove that requirement. Peter goes back to studying. He goes back because Mahito has shown him exactly what he needs to understand next, and unlike the early months of cursed energy training, this time he already knows what it means to be genuinely not ready for something. Peter Parker's training isn't finished. In fact, it's just getting started.